Hey guys, today we're going to talk about integer opposites and absolute value. Vocab that we need to remember would be integer, which is a positive and negative whole number. And don't forget, we will use a plus sign to indicate a positive number and this dash to indicate a negative number. And remember that the signs go before the number, such as down here, so this reads -4, and that after. This would read 4 minus. And that dash actually has two meanings. The first meaning that we usually use, we would read this as -5. This could also read the opposite of 5. So what we're going to do today is talk a little bit about opposites. And I have a few listed here for you, such as up and down and in and out, no and yes, and positive and negative. So our numbers are going to have opposites. Let's look at a few. If you have your number line, go ahead and take that out. You may want to follow along with that. So over on the right hand side in blue, we have 4. We want to find what its direct opposite would be. Well, we're going to use 0 as our midpoint. Okay, what is midway between 4 and the other number would be 0. So what we're going to do is we're going to start at 4 and count how many spaces it takes to get to 0. So in this case, 1, 2, 3, 4. So now that we're at our midpoint and it took 4 spaces to get to 0, we're going to count 4 spaces away from 0. 1, 2, 3, 4. And we end up at -4. Okay? So -4 is the opposite of 4. If we start at -4, 1, 2, 3, 4 spaces away is 0. So if we count from 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 spaces, that would be 4. So +4 is the opposite of -4. If we look at +2, that is 1, 2 spaces away from 0. If we count 1, 2 spaces, we end up at -2. If we start at -2 and count 1, 2 spaces to 0, and then count 1, 2 spaces, we end up at +2. So -2 and +2 are opposites of one another. Sometimes we'll see something written like the opposite of 5. So if we start here, we have 5 and we need to find the opposite of that. So the opposite of 5 would be -5. Okay? And then to find the opposite of that, we put a negative sign outside of parentheses where the opposite of 5 is contained within. So it would look something like this. So to resolve this, first thing we do is find the opposite of 5, which is 5. And then we have to find the opposite of 5, which is -5. Let's get some practice with this. You can use your number line to help you. So here are a couple examples I'd like you to work through. Pause the video and try these out, please. Okay, so the opposite of 7. Well, the opposite of 7 would be -7. The opposite of 10. The opposite of 10 would be -10. So the opposite of -9 would be +9. And then the opposite of -3 would be +3. The opposite of 6. So the opposite of 6 would be -6, and then the opposite of -6 would be +6. And then the last one, the opposite of negative 1. Well, the opposite of negative 1 would be 1. And then the opposite of 1 would be negative 1. How'd you do on those? Hopefully you got all of them right. Okay, so what this is leading into is a term called the absolute value. And the absolute value is indicated by these two lines surrounding a number. An absolute value is how far the term is away from 0. So we were just kind of doing that in using 0 as our midpoint to find something's opposite. Okay? So one other thing to note is that these two lines here, they are brackets. And brackets, in regard to the order of operation, are also parentheses. So when you're doing a problem that has absolute value, everything inside the brackets is going to have to go where the parentheses would go. So that would go among the first operations to go. So let's look at some examples here. So if we wanted to find the absolute value of 3, well, we'd start at 3. And we want to find how far the term is away from 0. So we'd go 1, 2, 3. So the absolute value of 3 is 3. How about the absolute value of 1? So we start at 1, make one jump, and so the absolute value of 1 is 1. The absolute value of negative 2. If we start at negative 2, we're going to do 1, 2 jumps. So the absolute value of negative 2 is 2. If we start at negative 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, the absolute value of negative 4 is 4. So now we're down to the opposite of the absolute value of 3. Well, like I just said, absolute value are brackets, so we have to first find the absolute value of 3, which is 1, 2, 3, and then find the opposite of that. So the opposite of 3 is negative 3. And now we have to find on the last one here the opposite of the absolute value of negative 3. So we start at negative 3, and that's 1, 2, 3 jumps away from 0. So the absolute value of negative 3 is 3, and then the opposite of that would be negative 3. Okay, let's get some practice in on these. Again, use your number lines if you need to. Okay. Pause the video and go ahead and see if you could determine the absolute value of these 6 questions. Alright, let's see how you did. Okay, so the absolute value of 6. 6 is 6 spaces away from 0, so the absolute value of 6 is 6. The absolute value of 12. The absolute value of 12, well, 12 is 12 spaces away from 0, so the absolute value of 12 is 12. The absolute value of negative 4. Well, negative 4 is 4 spaces away from 0, so the absolute value of negative 4 is 4. The absolute value of negative 13. Well, negative 13 is 13 spaces away from 0. So the absolute value of negative 13 is 13. So now we want the opposite of the absolute value of 15. So the absolute value of 15 is 15, because it's 15 spaces away from 0. And then we need to find the opposite of 15, which is negative 15. And then finally, the opposite of the absolute value of negative 8. Well, negative 8 is 8 spaces away from 0. And then we need to find the opposite of 8, which is negative 8. Okay, hopefully you got all those correct. But if you have some questions or concerns, we can talk about those in class. If you need to, please rewatch the video. And if you need further clarification, we're going to get that when I see you next time in class. Os.